There's something almost surreal about a town where time doesn't move. Springfield has been sitting there since December 17th, 1989, and in all that time, across more than 800 episodes, almost nothing has permanently changed. Bart is still 10, Homer still drives the same car to the same nuclear plant to work for the same ancient billionaire who can never quite remember his name. Marge still has the blue hair. The Quickie Mart is still open. And the donut at the end of the title sequence is still waiting on the same kitchen counter. It's a kind of dream logic, really. Springfield exists in a permanent present tense. The writers call it a floating timeline. The world advances around the show, but the show itself stays still. And for the most part, that's fine. It's part of what makes The Simpsons feel like home. You know where everything is, you know how the rooms are arranged, you know roughly how each episode will feel even before it starts. There's a comfort in that which I don't think gets acknowledged enough, especially when we talk about why so many people have watched this show in the dark, half asleep, for the better part of 3 decades. But here's the thing about Springfield. Even in a world where nobody ages and almost nothing changes forever, some people don't come back. Not because the writers ran out of ideas for them, not because they were written out with some big dramatic arc, but because they're simply gone. A character who was there last week isn't there this week. And if you've been watching long enough, you feel it, not always loudly, sometimes just as a small absence. An empty stool at Moe's Tavern. A desk at the back of Bart's classroom that doesn't have anyone in it anymore. The Simpsons has been on the air for 37 seasons as of 2026. That's a long time to spend with a cast of people. And across those years, the show has lost a handful of its regulars in ways that were meant to stick. Some of these deaths were huge, publicized in advance, mourned by millions of people who had grown up watching these characters. Some were barely acknowledged at all, just a small throwaway line letting you know that someone who used to be in the background had quietly stopped being in it. A few of them happened because the real people behind the voices passed away, and the show did the only thing that felt right, which was to let the character go too. What I want to do tonight is go through all of them. Every recurring character that The Simpsons killed off permanently, or as permanently as this show ever manages anything, roughly in the order they left us. We're going to take our time with each one, talk about who they were, how they went, and what their absence meant to the show and to the people who were watching. Some of these are genuinely sad. Some are funny in that specifically Simpsons way, where something is absurd and a little heartbreaking at the same time. And a couple of them have stories behind them that most people don't know, things that happened in the real world that ended up reshaping what you were watching on screen. If you're comfortable and you're listening in the dark, there's no rush here. This is the kind of thing worth taking slowly. The Simpsons has been a companion for a lot of us for a very long time. And the people and characters we're going to talk about tonight were part of why that companionship felt real. It's also worth saying before we go anywhere, that The Simpsons has a fairly unusual relationship with death generally. The show isn't shy about characters dying in the context of a joke. The Treehouse of Horror episodes kill pretty much everyone every October. But those don't count. They're outside the regular continuity. They're explicitly non-canon. And by the following week, everything is back to normal. What we're interested in here are the deaths that actually took. The ones that changed something, the ones where the show didn't pretend it hadn't happened. There aren't as many of them as you might expect given how long the show has been running. If anything, the list is shorter than it should be for 37 years of television. And I think that's deliberate. The writers have always understood that death in Springfield only means something if it's rare. If people died all the time, the way they do on, say, Game of Thrones, each individual loss would carry less weight. By keeping the permanent deaths few and chosen carefully, the show has made sure that when someone does leave for good, it lands. You remember where you were when you first watched it. We're going to start with the earliest of these, which also happens to be one of the gentlest and most genuinely moving exits the show has ever managed. It's a character who only appeared a handful of times across the whole series, but who meant more to one of the show's central characters than almost anyone else in Springfield. And the episode built around his death is the first time The Simpsons really showed what it was capable of when it decided to sit with something difficult and sad rather than rush through it. Actually, before I get there, I want to briefly mention subscribing here because I do that at the start rather than at the end. If this is the kind of video you enjoy, it genuinely helps. It's how this channel keeps making things like this. Right then, on we go. A quick bit of framing before we actually start. This list is specifically about characters from the regular continuity of the series, meaning the 37 seasons of the main show. I'm not including deaths from the 2007 Simpsons movie, because the show's relationship with that film's continuity is complicated at best, and I'm not including any Treehouse of Horror specials. And as we've already established, those exist in their own little bubbles where the rules don't apply. I'm also going to briefly touch on a few characters whose deaths weren't shown on screen but were confirmed in later episodes. The people who sort of quietly vanished and then we were told a season or two later that they were gone. Those matter too. The other thing I should probably say is that some of these deaths have stories attached to them that are more interesting than the deaths themselves. When a show has been running as long as The Simpsons, the lives of the people making it inevitably intersect with the show in ways you don't always expect. Voice actors pass away, contract negotiations go wrong. Personal decisions made in offices in Los Angeles end up reshaping storylines that millions of people watch. A few of the entries tonight are as much about what was happening behind the scenes as about what appeared on screen. And those are some of the most fascinating parts of this whole history. All right, Bleeding Gums Murphy. Let's start there. One thing I want to say before we actually start, and this is something I've been thinking about while putting this together. The reason these deaths feel significant, even the minor ones, even the background characters, is partly to do with duration. The Simpsons has been in people's homes, in their routines, as background noise on a Sunday evening or comfort viewing at midnight, for such an extraordinary length of time that the cast of the show has become genuinely familiar in a way that very little television manages. You've spent time with these voices. You've heard them in hundreds of different situations. And when a voice goes away, even one you couldn't have named if you'd been asked, there's a specific register of loss that I think is real, even if it's slightly embarrassing to admit about a cartoon. It's also worth saying that The Simpsons has a particular relationship with its long-term audience that most shows don't develop, simply because most shows don't last long enough. The people who watched the premiere in 1989 as adults are now approaching or past 60. The people who grew up with it in the 90s are well into their 40s. The other dimension to this that I find genuinely interesting is how different each of these deaths is from every other. There's no single model for how The Simpsons handles a permanent loss. Some are given enormous weight and built up over multiple seasons. Some happen in the first minute of an episode and are never revisited. Some come from creative decisions made by writers in a room, and some come from the real world, intruding on the fictional one in ways the writers didn't choose and couldn't control. The range is part of what makes the list worth exploring carefully rather than just listing and moving on. Each one tells you something slightly different about both the show's priorities and about the real people involved in making it. And when you put them all together, they form a picture of 35 years of a fictional town living with its losses, which it turns out is a fairly accurate picture of what any long-lived community looks like. Season 6, Episode 22. Round Springfield, first aired April 30th, 1995. And Ron Taylor voiced Bleeding Gums Murphy across 6 appearances in the show's first 6 seasons. And honestly, 6 appearances is almost nothing. Most recurring characters in Springfield show up far more frequently than that. But there's something about the specificity of who Bleeding Gums was and the way the show wrote him that made those 6 appearances feel like a lot more. He was a jazz saxophonist. That's the simplest way to describe him. He played late at night in parks and on street corners, and he had a dental situation that should probably have been addressed at some point, but never was. His teeth were the reason for the nickname, and the nickname was the reason most people in Springfield kept their distance. He wasn't famous, he wasn't successful in any conventional sense. And he had a record that sold about a dozen copies and a backstory involving a long estrangement from a brother he didn't know he had until very late in his life. He was, by most measures, a man the world had sort of passed over without noticing. But Lisa Simpson noticed. That's the whole thing. Their first meeting happens in Season 1, Episode 6, Moaning Lisa, which aired on February 11, 1990. It's only the 6th episode of the entire series, and already the show is doing something surprising with it. Lisa wakes up one night feeling an enormous, inexplicable sadness that she can't quite explain to herself or her family. Marge tries to tell her to smile and pretend she's fine, because that's generally what you do. Homer tries his best in the way Homer does, which is to say he tries very hard and mostly makes things worse. And none of it helps. Lisa wanders out of the house in the middle of the night and finds a man sitting on a park bench playing saxophone at 2 a.m. She sits down. She starts playing with him. And that's it, really. That's the whole relationship, established in about 3 minutes of screen time. Two people who are too big for the ordinary noise of the world around them, finding each other in the dark and making something together. It's one of the most understated, genuinely beautiful things the show has ever done, and it happens in the 6th episode. What Moaning Lisa establishes beyond the specific relationship between Lisa and Bleeding Gums is that The Simpsons was going to be a show capable of taking Lisa's interior life seriously. In 1990, that wasn't a given, and the show had been sold partly on Bart. He was the cultural phenomenon, the character on the t-shirts, the one who'd entered the vernacular. And it would have been easy for the writers to let Lisa exist primarily as the smart, responsible sister who provided occasional contrast to the chaos. Moaning Lisa said no to that very early. It gave Lisa real sadness, real depth, real recognition that a child's emotional experience is not smaller than an adult's just because the child is younger. And it gave her Bleeding Gums as the person who understood that about her. That decision in Season 1 is what gives the death in Season 6 its weight. By the time Orchard Around Springfield arrives, we have 5 more years of Lisa being Lisa, the frustrated musician, the overlooked intellect, or the person who cares too much in a world that often doesn't care enough. And Bleeding Gums has been there in the background of that story, the person who first saw what she was and reflected it back to her without qualification. His death is the loss of that, not just a character, but a mirror. Bleeding Gums. Murphy becomes, in the few appearances that follow, something genuinely rare in The Simpsons. An adult who takes Lisa seriously, not as a child who should be managed or pacified or told to adjust her expectations, but as a real person with real feelings and a real musical gift that deserves to be taken seriously. He's not her teacher exactly. He's more like a peer who happens to be 50 years older. He speaks to her like she's already the person she's working to become. And for a character like Lisa, who spends most of her time surrounded by people who underestimate her, that means everything. So when Round Springfield arrives in Season 6 and we find out that Bleeding Gums has been admitted to hospital, that he's very sick, that he's been sick for a while, that he's not going to get better, it's genuinely upsetting, not in a showy, dramatic way, just quietly, in the way it is when someone who mattered is no longer going to be there. Lisa visits him in hospital. They play together one last time, her saxophone through the window of his ward. He dies that night without fuss or fanfare, and Lisa has to figure out what to do with that. She wants people to know who he was. She wants his music to live somewhere beyond this. And the episode follows her trying to get a hold of one of his records, an obscure jazz album called Jazzman, so that she can play it on the radio and let Springfield hear him one last time through the speakers of KBBL. There's a subplot about Bart and a saxophone he swallows and a medical bill, which is classic Simpsons tonal juggling. But the Lisa storyline is what the episode is really about. The ending is one of the show's most remembered images from its golden period. Bleeding Gums appears in the clouds above Springfield, playing saxophone. Lisa looks up and sees him there. It's earnest in a way the show doesn't always allow itself to be. No punchline, no subversion, just a kid looking up at the sky and saying goodbye to someone who understood her. Ron Taylor, who voiced Bleeding Gums and was himself a musician, a singer and actor who had performed on Broadway. He understood the character from the inside in a way that probably can't be faked. He was also, at the time the show was making these episodes, living with his own health challenges. He passed away on July 7, 2005 at 64. By that point, Bleeding Gums had already been gone from Springfield for a decade. But there's something quietly layered about knowing that the man behind the voice had his own relationship with illness and time. Something worth dwelling on for a moment is the specific music that's associated with Bleeding Gums across his appearances. The show's composer Alf Clausen wrote a recurring jazz motif for the character that became genuinely recognizable across those handful of episodes. It's not a complicated piece, it's a slow, blue, saxophone forward thing that the show associates with Lisa's sadness as much as with Bleeding Gums himself. When that motif plays in Round Springfield after his death, it functions as both his musical signature and his eulogy. Clausen understood what the character meant to Lisa and built that into the score at a level that doesn't require any dialogue to land. The other thing about Round Springfield that doesn't get discussed enough is how Lisa comes to have the record in her hands in the first place. Bart has swallowed a saxophone reed in a parallel storyline and is in hospital, and Lisa goes to visit him. While she's there, in that same hospital on that same day, she discovers that Bleeding Gums is in a ward upstairs. She visits him. They play together through the window, his saxophone from inside, hers from outside, separated by glass. It's not played for enormous drama, it's just two people playing music because they can and because it's good. And then he's gone. The episode weaves together Bart's medical subplot and Lisa's grief subplot in a way that keeps the show from drowning in its own sadness, which is such a typically Simpsons move. Putting something absurd right next to something tender and trusting the audience to hold both simultaneously. Bart's storyline is comedy. Lisa's is grief. The show handles them at the same time without either one undercutting the other. That's harder to do than it looks. There's also the small detail that the album Lisa eventually plays over the air, the one called Jazzman, exists only because a pawn shop in Springfield happened to have a copy. It's purchased for $600 by Lisa at the last moment using money that was supposed to be for Bart's hospital bill. She spends the money meant for her brother's medical treatment to preserve a dead man's music. The show lets that beat land without comment. Bart, to his credit, doesn't hold it against her. The thing I find most moving about Bleeding Gums Murphy, looking back at him now, isn't actually his death episode. It's that first night in the park in season 1. Two people meeting in the dark, playing music together because it's the only language that covers everything they need to say. There's nothing more to it than that, but there doesn't need to be. Now, let's talk about someone whose departure from the show was so quiet and so understated that most people didn't even notice until a memorial plaque showed up in the background of a completely different episode. There's a very specific type of Simpsons character death, and it goes like this. The character just stops showing up. No farewell episode, no dramatic moment, no in-story acknowledgement. They were there, and then they weren't. And if you weren't paying close attention, you might not even notice the gap. And then, several seasons later, some throwaway reference establishes that they've been dead the whole time. Dr. Marvin Monroe is the textbook example. He was Springfield's resident therapist, introduced in season 1, episode 4, There's No Disgrace Like Home, when Homer takes the family to his practice for counseling. But Monroe was a recurring character through the early seasons, pompous, perpetually exasperated, the kind of man who had clearly gone into therapy because he found other people's problems more manageable than his own. Harry Shearer voiced him with a particular kind of strained professional patience that made him instantly recognizable. And then, after season 4, he simply wasn't there anymore. Not killed in an episode, not written out. Just gone from the rotation, the way recurring background characters sometimes drift off in a long-running show when the writers stop finding them useful. Here's where it gets interesting. Season 8, Episode 23, Homer's Enemy, aired on May 4th, 1997. It's an episode we'll return to in much more detail shortly, because it's arguably the most significant of all the deaths on this list from a creative standpoint. But in the background of that episode, almost as a piece of visual trivia, there's a reference to the Marvin Monroe Memorial Hospital. Memorial, as in the man the hospital was named after is dead. It's a joke, essentially. A blink and you'll miss a confirmation that yes, Monroe had died sometime off-screen between his last appearance and this episode, and nobody thought it warranted any further discussion. That's very much in the spirit of early Simpsons continuity, which was always fairly casual about these things. And then season 9 arrived and Monroe showed up again, alive, just sort of around in the background. Homer even directly acknowledges it. He says something along the lines of, "I thought you were dead." And Monroe replies, with magnificent vagueness, "Indeed, me amo, very sick." And then they move on. This is the Simpsons continuity situation at its most wonderfully chaotic. A character who is confirmed dead by implication in one season, casually alive in the next, and then quietly absent again after that. He makes a handful of further background appearances before disappearing entirely for good. No one in Springfield ever brings it up again. The reason Monroe's story is worth examining slightly more carefully than it might first appear is what it reveals about the show's early relationship with its own continuity. The Simpsons, in its first 8 or 9 seasons, was not a show that maintained careful internal records of what had been established in previous episodes. Individual writers would introduce details, characters, or even deaths, and subsequent episodes would either honor those details or ignore them depending entirely on what was useful that week. There was no continuity Bible being consulted. There was no one in the room saying, "Hold on, Monroe is dead, you can't use him." The Memorial Hospital was almost certainly a joke by John Swartzwelder, who wrote Homer's Enemy. That referenced Monroe's disappearance from the rotation in a knowing, winking way. Swartzwelder was one of the more arch and self-aware writers on the staff. His scripts are full of this kind of quiet acknowledgement that the show exists in an absurd universe with arbitrary rules. The Monroe Memorial was probably a joke about the fact that characters on The Simpsons simply stop appearing without explanation. He filed under things the audience might notice if they're paying attention. And then when Monroe turned up alive in season 9, it was probably a different writer who either hadn't read Homer's Enemy carefully or had read it and decided that the very sick explanation was funnier than simply pretending the Memorial Hospital didn't exist. The very sick line is the correct choice. It's 2 words, and it perfectly encapsulates the show's attitude toward its own contradictions, which is yes and. This approach to continuity, loose and self-amused rather than rigorous, is actually part of what made early Simpsons comedy so efficient. The writers weren't spending energy maintaining an internal rulebook. They were writing the funniest possible version of each scene, and if that occasionally meant a dead character came back to life with a 2-word handwave, then that was a price worth paying for the laugh the handwave produced. Monroe's "very sick" is probably funnier than any dignified resolution to the continuity problem would have been. It's the show acknowledging the problem and declining to solve it, and in that declination finding something more satisfying than a solution. I find Monroe weirdly endearing because of this. He exists in the show's memory as a bit of a ghost, perpetually somewhere between life and death, present and absent, confirmed gone, and then immediately not. It says something about the show's early approach to its own continuity that this was handled with essentially zero ceremony. Nobody cared that much in the best possible way. The reason I've included him here, rather than relegating him to the honorable mentions at the end, is that the very sick line is one of the funniest and most casually absurd pieces of continuity management the show has ever done. They knew they'd written him out. They knew about the memorial hospital joke. They brought him back anyway and just had him wave it off with 2 words. It's a very particular kind of comedy that doesn't get enough credit. Now, from someone who died in the background of someone else's episode, to someone who died in the most explosively, memorably chaotic fashion in the show's history, and whose death is actually a piece of sustained satirical criticism of the show's own premise. Season 8, Episode 23. Homer's Enemy. May 4th, 1997. This is, by some margin, the most intellectually interesting death in the entire show's history. Not the most emotionally resonant, we'll get to those, but the one that says the most about the show's self-awareness, its willingness to interrogate its own logic, and its understanding of what it had become by Season 8. It was written by John Swartzwelder, who is widely considered one of the greatest writers in the show's history. And it uses the device of a single character's arrival and death within one episode to make an argument about Homer Simpson that the show had never previously been willing to make directly. Frank Grimes, or Grimy as he preferred, is introduced at the start of Homer's Enemy as a new employee at the Springfield nuclear power plant. The episode sets him up with almost documentary care as a genuine working-class hero. He grew up in poverty. His parents abandoned him when he was 4. He was in a silo explosion at 18 that left him studying by himself for years, by mail while working 2 jobs. He earned his way to a degree in nuclear physics through sheer stubborn effort. And by the time he arrives at the plant, he is a qualified, skilled, hardworking professional who has earned every single thing he has through application and discipline. And then he meets Homer Simpson. The engine of the episode is Grimes, slowly realizing that Homer's life, a life of spectacular incompetence, barely controlled chaos, and absolutely no professional standards, has somehow produced more rewards than his own. Homer has a lovely house and a family. Homer is friends with the plant owner. Homer has, at various points, been an astronaut and a professional boxing promoter. Homer has done essentially nothing right, is professionally speaking, at any point in his career, and none of this has made any difference to the material quality of his existence. The universe has been unfathomably generous to Homer Simpson in ways that bear no relationship to what Homer deserves. Grimes finds this unbearable. Not as comedy, not as a joke. The episode plays his frustration almost completely straight, which is what makes it so unusual within the show's canon. He doesn't become a villain in the traditional sense. He just becomes increasingly, visibly unable to process the fundamental injustice of what he's seeing. His arc is essentially the arc of anyone who has ever tried very hard and then looked sideways at someone who hasn't tried at all and had a much easier time of it. Most of us have felt the version of what Frank Grimes is feeling in this episode, which is precisely why it works. The death itself is almost a release. Grimes has descended into a kind of manic episode, imitating Homer's style, touching live wires, ignoring safety protocols, to demonstrate that if Homer can do this and survive, then anyone can do it and survive. He grabs 2 exposed electrical cables and electrocutes himself, laughing. The assembled workers look at him. Then everyone turns back to Homer, who has fallen asleep and who mumbles something about changing the channel. The funeral follows shortly after, and in the middle of what should be a solemn moment, Homer falls asleep again and makes an embarrassing noise, and the other mourners laugh. The implication, and this is the part that Swartzwelder is making so deliberately, is that the rules of this universe don't apply fairly, and the only person who ever noticed was the one person the universe would not protect. Frank Grimes wasn't a villain. He wasn't wrong about anything he observed. He was simply a man who tried to apply real-world logic to a world that doesn't run on real-world logic, and the world destroyed him for it. What's lovely, in a dark way, is what happened to Grimes after his death. He became one of the most beloved figures in the show's entire run. Fan communities adopted him as a kind of patron saint, the reasonable man trapped in an unreasonable world. His nickname, Grimy, became shorthand for a particular kind of exasperated dignity. There's a running thread in Simpsons fan discussion where people apply the "what would Grimes think of this" test to various Homer storylines, essentially asking whether the episode passes the basic logic check that Grimes tried and failed to apply during his one episode of existence. Hank Azaria voiced him, and Azaria has said in interviews that he found the character genuinely compelling. A real person dropped into the middle of a cartoon and destroyed by the difference. There's something to that. Grimes is the only character in Springfield's history who seems fully aware that the show he's in doesn't operate like the world he thinks he's in. And that awareness is what kills him. The critical response to Homer's enemy has always been interesting to track. At the time of broadcast, it was polarizing. Some people loved it immediately and understood what it was doing. Others found it difficult, felt that the episode was too dark, that having Homer's carelessness cause someone's death was going a step beyond what the show should be doing with its central character. There was a sense in some of the early reviews and fan discussions that the episode had stepped outside the acceptable boundaries of what a Simpsons episode was meant to be. That reaction has almost completely inverted over time. Homer's Enemy is now consistently ranked as one of the best episodes in the show's entire run. It sits on nearly every best of list anyone assembles. The IMDb user rating for it is 9.3 out of 10, which makes it the single highest rated episode in the show's history. Out of more than 800 episodes, the episode that was criticized at the time for going too far is now considered the high water mark. What changed is probably the culture around the show more than anything in the episode itself. Season 8 is now understood as part of the show's undisputed golden period, and Homer's Enemy is seen as the culmination of a particular strand of Simpsons writing. The idea that Homer, despite being the show's protagonist and a figure of great warmth and comedy, is also genuinely and consistently not a good person by any standard of fairness or competence. Grimes just makes that explicit on screen with someone whose entire life was shaped by those standards. There's also something worth noting about the comedy of Grimes' death that sometimes gets lost in the discussion of its significance. It is objectively very funny. The two live wires, the cackling, the immediate cut to the funeral where Homer falls asleep. The fact that the assembled mourners laugh at Homer's outburst rather than at anything related to Grimes himself. Swartzwelder understood that the episode could be devastating and hilarious simultaneously, and that the comedy didn't undercut the point. It amplified it. The funniest possible version of "the world is unfair" is the one where the unfairness continues right through the funeral. Frank Grimes Jr. appears later in the series, in season 14 as it happens, as a character defined entirely by his hatred of Homer, which he has inherited and which has curdled across the years into a specific targeted vengeance project. He doesn't get much screen time, but his existence is a kind of continuation of Grimes' argument that the effects of Homer Simpson on the people around him don't simply end when the episode does, but they accumulate, they get handed down. There's a running thread in Simpsons fan culture around what people call the Grimes test, the question of whether any given Homer storyline would read as obviously unfair and absurd if a reasonable person were placed inside it. The test is informal. No one invented it officially, it just circulates. But it's a useful lens. Most Homer episodes fail it spectacularly. That's the point. Homer's life doesn't make sense from the outside. It only works if you accept the specific suspended logic of Springfield, the way you accept the logic of a dream while you're in it. Frank Grimes refused to accept it. He held the dream up to the light of the waking world and found it monstrous. and the dream destroyed him. The fact that we're still talking about him decades after he appeared in one episode and died, he says everything about the quality of that writing. He had 22 minutes. That's it. And he left a bigger impression on the show's cultural history than most characters who appeared in 100 episodes. Now, talking a bit about someone whose death was very public, very discussed, and had its roots not in Springfield, but in a salary negotiation in Los Angeles. Season 11, Episode 14. Alone Again, Natura Diddley. February 13th, 2000. Maud Flanders had been part of The Simpsons since very early in the show's run. She first appeared in Season 2, and from that point forward, she was a steady, reliable presence in Springfield. Ned's wife, the mother of Rod and Todd, a gentle counterpart to the Simpsons family across the fence. She wasn't a scene stealer. She wasn't the kind of character who got the big comedic moments. Yet she was just there, warm and consistent, the same way that certain people in your life are just reliably there, forming part of the background of your existence without necessarily demanding attention. And then in February 2000, at a NASCAR race, she was killed by a volley of t-shirts fired from a promotional cannon. The first thing to understand about Maud's death is that it didn't come from a story decision made in a writer's room brainstorm. It came from a contract dispute. Maggie Roswell, the voice actress who played Maud, had been living in Denver and flying to Los Angeles to record. It's a long way. She'd been doing it for years, and by 1999, the year the main Simpsons cast negotiated significant pay increases, she asked the production for a travel stipend to cover the flights. Fox refused, so she left. The production was faced with a choice: recast the character, quietly retire her, or write her out of the show in a way that was permanent and clear. They chose the third option. Executive producer Mike Scully said at the time that they saw it as an opportunity, a chance to give one of the regular characters something genuinely difficult to face, something that couldn't be undone and would have real consequences for subsequent episodes. He said they didn't want to kill a character for the sake of killing. They wanted it to mean something going forward. So Maud's death was designed to reshape Ned Flanders, not just as an episode, but as a character across the seasons that followed. The episode itself is tonal whiplash in the way that The Simpsons frequently is, and which is to say it handles the absurdity of the setup, Homer leaning forward to catch a t-shirt, the cannons redirecting, Maud taking the full volley and falling from the bleachers, and then pivots to Ned's genuine grief without making it feel cheap. The show had always done this, placed something ridiculous next to something real and trusted the audience to hold both at once. It generally works. It works here. What followed in subsequent seasons is what makes Maud's death genuinely significant in the show's history. Ned didn't bounce back immediately. His faith was tested in a way the show took seriously. He dated, awkwardly and painfully. He got involved with various women across subsequent seasons, and the show acknowledged that losing a spouse after decades of marriage does something to a person that isn't resolved in 22 minutes. But there was an ongoing thread of loneliness and reconstruction in Ned's character that ran for several seasons, and eventually, in season 22, it led somewhere remarkable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The other thing that happened after Maud's death was that Maggie Roswell in the show eventually reconciled. She returned in a reduced capacity in later seasons, voicing other characters. The decision to kill Maud was never reversed, and the show held firm on that. But the relationship between Roswell and the production eventually became civil again. It's a slightly uncomfortable footnote to the story. A character died because of a pay dispute, and then the person who played her came back anyway, just playing different characters. Roswell has spoken about this in interviews with a mixture of sadness and pragmatism. She loved Maud. She didn't want Maud to die. And she also understood by the time she came back that the death had been handled with more care than it might have been. One of the more interesting creative decisions around Maud's death is how the episode itself handles the gap between its premise and its emotional ambitions. The t-shirt canon is absurd. There's no way around that. The cause of death is, by any objective measure, ridiculous. a promotional stunt gone wrong at a motor racing event, a volley of souvenir shirts, redirected by Homer's instincts toward free merchandise. It's the kind of cause of death that belongs in a comedy because it is inherently comic. And yet the show needs the death to land emotionally because the whole point is that Ned's life changes permanently after this moment. So the episode has to hold the absurdity of the how alongside the seriousness of the what, and it does this by cutting away from the comedy fairly quickly once Maude has fallen. The ambulance arrives, the tone shifts, Ned is left alone on the bleachers, and the episode stops making jokes about that part. There's something instructive in this about how The Simpsons approaches grief specifically. The show has always understood that grief arrives in the same world as comedy, that the two exist simultaneously, and that neither one invalidates the other. Homer reaching for a free t-shirt is exactly the kind of thing Homer does, and the fact that it has terrible consequences is part of the show's ongoing conversation with itself about what Homer's selfishness costs the people around him. Maude dies because Homer wanted a free t-shirt, and that fact is never resolved, never meaningfully addressed, and Ned never holds Homer responsible for it in any sustained way. Springfield just absorbs the event and moves on. That detail has bothered some people over the years. There's an episode late in the show's run, Flanders' Ladder, in season 30, in which Bart dreams of dead Springfieldians, and among them is Maude, who suggests that Homer is partly responsible for what happened at that racetrack. It's played as a nightmare rather than as a genuine moral reckoning, but the show chose to include that detail, which suggests the writers were aware that there's an unresolved thread there, even if Springfield's social contract doesn't allow for it to be pulled. The Ned Flanders who exists in the later seasons of the show is a meaningfully different character than the Ned who existed before season 11. Losing Maude gave the show permission to do things with Ned that wouldn't have been possible while she was alive, including eventually his relationship with Edna Crabapple. The two characters who were left alone by their respective losses, finding each other is the kind of payoff that only becomes possible in a show that has been running long enough to accumulate genuine history. The arc Ned travels between Maude's death in season 11 and his eventual remarriage in season 23 spans 12 years of television and represents one of the more sustained pieces of character development in the show's later period. It's not always handled consistently. Nothing in The Simpsons across 23 seasons is entirely consistent. But the through line is real. Ned is a man who built his entire life around his faith and his marriage, and losing Maude forces him to discover what he is without either of those things as they'd previously existed. His faith is tested in early post-Maude episodes in ways that feel genuine. He doubts, he questions, he eventually rebuilds, but the rebuilt version is slightly different from the original. A little more aware of how quickly things can change, a little less certain that his optimism is the full story. The dating episodes that follow Maude's death across seasons 12 through 22 are patchy in quality, but collectively they trace something real about what it's like to re-enter the world after a long marriage ends. Ned meets people who are wrong for him in various ways. He gets his heart broken, he makes mistakes, he tries too hard, he sometimes overcorrects into excessive religious observance as a way of avoiding the underlying grief. All of this is the show doing the work that Scully promised when he said that death would have consequences. It's just that the consequences play out over a decade rather than a single episode. What Maude Flanders represents in the show's history is a kind of proof of concept. Evidence that Springfield could change in permanent ways, that a major supporting character could be removed, and the show could carry that absence forward honestly rather than quietly pretending it hadn't happened. Every subsequent permanent death in the series is standing on the ground that Maude's death prepared. Maude Flanders was the first character The Simpsons killed, whose death was designed to have ongoing narrative consequences. She was the proof that the show could absorb real grief and keep going. And in a quiet way, every significant death that followed owed something to the decision made about her in 1999, in an office in Los Angeles during a conversation about plane tickets. Since we're moving through the earlier seasons, and since the next departure is much lighter in tone, I promise. Let's talk about Lisa's cat. Season 15, Episode 9. I, Annoyed Grunt, Bot. January 4th, 2004. Right, the cat. Snowball the second, important distinction, she was the second one, had been the Simpson family's black cat since the very first episode of the series. She appears in Simpsons roasting on an open fire as part of the household, quietly present in the way family pets are, doing cat things in the background of scenes across 15 seasons. The original Snowball, the first one, had died before the series even began, run over by a Chrysler, according to Marge's Christmas letter in that premiere episode. Snowball 2 was her replacement, named to preserve some continuity of feeling even if the actual animal was different. And in season 15, Dr. Julius Hibbert runs her over with his car. That's it. That's how she goes. Dr. Hibbert, the kindly family physician, running over the cat with the car. The show doesn't linger on it. It cuts to Snowball's funeral, Lisa devastated, and then the episode does something brilliantly strange. Lisa gets a new cat, and that cat immediately dies too, so she gets another one. Same result, then another. Each replacement cat dies in a sudden and different way in rapid succession. A sort of absurdist escalation of feline tragedy that plays as black comedy, but underneath which is a genuinely real observation about how many pets some of us go through over a lifetime and how each one is its own small grief. The resolution is one of the show's more elegantly cynical moments. Lisa finds a cat that looks exactly like Snowball II and decides to name her Snowball II as well, on the basis that it would save money on buying a new food dish. Marge quietly points out that this is a rationalization. Lisa essentially shrugs and accepts that it is. The family goes back to calling the new cat Snowball II, and that's what she's been called ever since. What I find interesting about this, beyond the comedy of it, is what it says about grief and replacement in a world that doesn't change. The original Snowball 2 had been around for 15 seasons, longer than most of the human recurring characters in Springfield have lasted without a major storyline. The show treated her death the same way real families sometimes treat the death of a pet, with genuine sadness immediately covered over by a practical decision, which is slightly uncomfortable but also entirely human. The broader pet history of the Simpsons household is worth a brief mention here, just because it puts Snowball's departure in context. Santa's little helper, the greyhound they adopt at Christmas in S1, has outlasted everyone else in the animal kingdom of this show. He's still going, still chewing furniture, still occasionally being the subject of his own episode. There's something deeply right about that. The dog lived, the cats kept dying. That tracks somehow. The cascade of replacement cats in I, Annoyed Grunt, Bot is one of those sequences that works as pure comedy but has a slightly unsettling undertow when you sit with it. Lisa goes through a series of cats in rapid succession, each one named in the moment and gone before you've properly registered the name. The joke is relentless and escalating in exactly the way Simpsons comedy at its best tends to be. But underneath it is something about the way we manage loss by immediately seeking replacement. Lisa doesn't grieve the individual cats because she can't, they're replaced too quickly. And the show is gently pointing at something there about how grief gets short-circuited when we cover it over with something new immediately. And the final cat and the Snowball 2 replacement isn't a worked-through resolution to the grief. It's Lisa deciding that the food dish matters more than the accuracy of the name, and that maybe that's fine. Maybe continuity of symbol matters more than continuity of actual animal. Maybe the dish is the point. There's also something worth noting about what Lisa's choice here says about her relationship with practicality. Lisa is, by the show's general characterization, the person most likely to insist on the honest, difficult thing over the convenient, comfortable thing. She's the one who tells hard truths. She's the vegetarian, the environmentalist, the person who reads the fine print. And yet when it comes to her own grief over Snowball II, she takes the least emotionally honest path available. She calls the new cat by the old cat's name, but tells herself it's about the dish and moves on. The show doesn't judge her for it. Neither should we. It's a very human thing to do. Sometimes the symbol is enough. Sometimes you need the familiar name more than you need the accurate one. The broader pet history of the Simpsons household is worth a brief mention here, just because it puts Snowball's departure in context. Santa's little helper, the greyhound they adopted at Christmas in season 1, has outlasted everyone else in the animal kingdom of this show. He's still going, still chewing furniture, still occasionally being the subject of his own episode. There's something deeply right about that. The dog lived, the cats kept dying. That tracks, somehow. Since we're talking about characters departing quietly and with relatively little ceremony, here's another one from the same general era. One whose exit was even more offhand. Season 18, Episode 2. Jazzy and the Pussycats. September 24th, 2006. Some Deaths in Springfield arrive with their own episode. A full 22 minutes of screen time, a story built around the loss, a chance to sit with what the absence means. Amber Simpson did not get that. Amber Simpson got about a minute and a half at the start of an episode that was mostly about Bart playing the drums, and then the show moved on. If you need a quick recap of who Amber was, in season 13, Homer and Bart travel to Las Vegas for a weekend that goes fairly typically for Homer, which is to say, catastrophically. Homer ends up drunkenly married to a woman named Amber, played by Pamela Hayden. This happens to Barney simultaneously, a parallel Vegas marriage for comedic symmetry. But the situation is eventually resolved, sort of, in the way the show resolves things it doesn't want to deal with permanently, which is to say, Homer leaves and the problem is left slightly hanging. Amber appeared a couple of times after that initial storyline, most notably in a season 16 episode where she turns up at the Simpson house causing complications. She was a recurring loose end more than a recurring character, someone the show had created and wasn't entirely sure what to do with long term. Jazzy and the Pussycats opens with Amber's funeral. We're told she died of a drug overdose. That's the totality of it. Homer is there, briefly sad, and then the episode is about something else entirely. The way her death is handled, quickly, matter-of-factly, near at the top of an episode that isn't about her, says something about her narrative function in the show. She was introduced as a complication for Homer and Marge, and when the writers no longer needed that complication, she was removed cleanly and without much fanfare. I don't say that to be harsh, it's just the mechanics of how a long-running show manages the cast of characters it accumulates. Not every character who gets written in needs to get written out with ceremony. Sometimes people just die briefly in the first few minutes of an episode, and the camera moves on. What stays with me about Amber is the specificity of what she represented, which was a version of Homer's life in which he made different choices and ended up somewhere much sadder. She was the path not taken, presented as a comedy beat, and then disposed of as one too. And that's a little bleak if you look at it from a certain angle. But most things in Springfield are, if you look at them from the right angle. There's a broader pattern worth noting here that Amber's death exemplifies. The Simpsons has, across its later seasons especially, accumulated a small category of characters who were created as complications or plot devices, served their narrative purpose, and were then written out in the most efficient manner available. Which is to say, a brief mention of death, usually at the start of an episode that's about something else. It's not cruel exactly, it's just practical. A show with this many characters across this many seasons cannot afford to give every exit its own episode. Some people get the full treatment, some people get 90 seconds at the start of an episode about a drum kit. What's the interesting thing about how the show handled Amber across her brief run is that it was never quite sure what to do with her beyond the initial comedy of the Vegas marriage. She represented a genuine loose end. Homer had technically committed bigamy, a fact the show never fully resolved but also never quite swept under the carpet either. Her reappearance in season 16 made some use of that unresolved status, but not in a way that went anywhere significant. Her death in season 18 is the show finally choosing to close the bracket on a situation it had left open for 5 seasons. It's also worth noting that Pamela Hayden, who voiced Amber, is better known to Simpsons fans as the voice of Milhouse Van Houten, a character who is very much still alive and regularly tripping over himself at Springfield Elementary. The same person voiced both a character who outlasted everyone and a character who got 90 seconds of funeral. That's the range of what's available in Springfield. What Amber's quiet, efficient departure also demonstrates is that the show has always been comfortable with a certain kind of matter-of-factness about death in the Springfield universe. Not every death requires processing. Some people simply stop being in the story, and the story acknowledges it with a line and a scene and then continues. That matter-of-factness isn't callousness. It's part of the show's honest engagement with how mortality actually operates in most of our lives, which is to say that most deaths don't arrive with enough warning for a proper episode about them. Sometimes you find out at the start of a conversation that someone you knew isn't around anymore. And the conversation moves on, and you carry it quietly. That was Amber. The next person on this list was someone Homer couldn't carry quietly at all. Someone whose absence followed him around for years, and whose death, when it finally came, arrived at exactly the wrong moment. Season 19, Episode 19. Mona Leavza, May 11th, 2008. This one is, for my money, the most emotionally sophisticated death in the show's history before we get to Krabappel. And we will get to Krabappel. But Mona Simpson's exit from the show achieves something quite specific and quite difficult, which is to make you feel the weight of an unfinished conversation. Not just a death, but a particular kind of death where what you're mourning is also all the things that were left unsaid. Let me explain who Mona was, and because she's actually one of the show's more quietly radical creations. Homer's mother, voiced across multiple appearances by Glenn Close, first appeared in Season 7's Mother Simpson, which aired November 19, 1995, and is widely considered one of the greatest episodes in the show's entire run. The premise: Homer fakes his own death to get out of a work obligation, and in doing so accidentally reunites with his mother, who had been presumed dead for most of his life. The reason she wasn't dead, she was on the run. Mona Simpson had been a 1960s political activist, and at one point in her past, she'd been involved in an action against Mr. Burns, accidentally releasing a gas that destroyed one of his germ warfare laboratories. Burns had her arrested. She escaped. And from that point forward, she'd been living as a fugitive, but moving from place to place under assumed identities, unable to come home because coming home would mean going to prison. She left Homer as a child, not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't stay without putting him at risk. She spent decades loving him from a distance, and he grew up thinking she was dead. Mother Simpson is devastating in a very particular way. Homer and Mona reconnect over the course of the episode, and then, because she can't stay, Burns has alerted the authorities. She has to leave again. The final image is Homer sitting on the roof of his car in the middle of nowhere, watching the stars, staying there long after she's gone. No punchline, just a man sitting with the fact that his mother had to leave again and that he couldn't do anything about it. She returns across several subsequent episodes, as always having to leave again at the end, always pursued by something or someone that makes staying impossible. And Homer each time has to rebuild himself around another departure. By the time Mona Leavza arrives in season 19, he has genuinely closed himself off to her. He's too tired of being hurt by someone who keeps promising to stay and keeps not being able to. The episode follows Mona returning once more, this time swearing she's done running, swearing she'll finally stay. Homer doesn't believe her. He's cruel to her in the specific way you're cruel to people who have disappointed you so many times that you've stopped protecting them from your anger. She tries to win him back over. He keeps his walls up. And then she dies quietly in the Simpsons' living room, while Homer is elsewhere in the house still being angry at her. And he was going to apologize. He says this after. He was on his way to tell her he was sorry for how he'd acted, but by the time he gets to the room, she's gone. Glenn Close, in interviews about her involvement with the character, spoke about the care that was taken with Mona across those episodes. She found the character genuinely moving, a woman whose love for her son was never in question, even when her ability to be present for him consistently failed. Close said she brought a real emotional investment to the recordings that she found surprising given the medium. It's worth pausing on what it means for a show to have Glenn Close return across multiple seasons to voice a recurring character. Close is by any measure one of the most significant actors of her generation. Multiple Academy Award nominations. An Akiyu career spanning decades of serious film and theater work. She comes back to voice Mona Simpson repeatedly across 12 years, from season 7 to season 19, because she found the role genuinely worth doing. That says something about how the show was written during its middle period. The writing for Mona is good enough, emotionally layered enough, that it attracted and retained someone who had no shortage of other options. The specific mechanics of how Glenn Close was cast in the first place have never been fully detailed publicly, but the show had by season 7 established a clear record of casting genuinely prominent actors in recurring and guest roles, and more importantly, of writing those roles as actual characters rather than celebrity cameos. Mona wasn't designed to be Glenn Close doing a guest spot. She was designed to be Homer's mother, a real person with a real complicated history, and the casting served the character rather than the reverse. One element of Mona's story that doesn't get discussed as often as it deserves to is the political dimension of who she was. She was a 60s radical. She went on the run because of her activism. And the show, which is not generally a politically engaged program in any direct sense, treats her radicalism with genuine respect. The show doesn't undercut her politics. It doesn't frame her activism as naive or misguided in hindsight. When Homer carries out her final plan at the end of Mona Leavesa, stopping Burns' rocket, he's doing it because it's right, not just because his mother wanted it. Her politics are presented as having been correct all along. That's a choice the writers made, and it's a meaningful one. That first episode set the template for everything that followed. Mother Simpson establishes that Mona's relationship with Homer is structured around leaving. Every time she comes back, the story ends with her going, and each time it takes something out of Homer that he only partially recovers before the next time she leaves. By the time she dies in season 19, the ground has been prepared across 12 years of television. The specific grief Homer feels, guilt mixed with love, mixed with the exhaustion of hope, repeatedly disappointed, is something the show has been building toward across all of that time. It doesn't arrive without context. It arrives as the conclusion to one of the show's longer, quieter, most human storylines. The episode ends with Homer fulfilling Mona's last wish. She'd had a plan, of course, one final act of protest, stopping Mr. Burns from launching a rocket that would poison the Amazon rainforest. Homer carries it out in her memory, reluctantly and chaotically, as Homer always does. But he carries it out. Mona may not have been able to stay, but her spirit, that stubborn, inconvenient, activist spirit, outlasted the woman herself. The dedication at the end of the episode reads, "In memory of Patty Jacobs and Mary Jo Castellaneta." The mothers of Harry Shearer and Dan Castellaneta, who had both died before the episode aired. It gives the whole thing another layer of real grief, a reminder that the people making the show were writing about something they were living with themselves. What Homer loses with Mona isn't just a mother, it's the chance to have the conversation he kept putting off. And every time the show returned to her across those years, it was doing something quietly important, reminding the audience that some conversations have deadlines you can't see coming, that you don't always get the chance to say the thing you mean to say. One of the curious effects of the show's floating timeline is that grief within the Springfield universe operates differently than it would in a realistic chronology. The loss, the reunion, the repeated departures, the final absence. These have their own emotional coherence that the calendar doesn't need to validate. Homer's grief for Mona is real within the show's emotional logic regardless of what year any of it technically happened in. And that, oddly, makes the grief feel more universal rather than less. It's not tied to a specific date. It's tied to a pattern. And the pattern, the person who keeps leaving, the unfinished conversation, the apology that arrives too late, is one that a lot of people who've watched this show across a lot of years will recognize from somewhere in their own lives. And talking of people leaving Springfield, Fat Tony's exit is a good one to sit with next, partly because of what the show did in the immediate aftermath. Season 22, Episode 9. Donnie Fatso, December 5th, 2010. Fat Tony had been a constant in Springfield since Season 3, voiced by Joe Mantegna. And I want to be clear, Joe Mantegna is perfect in this role, with this low, warm, but slightly world-weary baritone that makes even mundane mob pronouncements sound like they carry ancient weight. He appeared as the city's resident mob boss across a remarkable number of episodes, the kind of recurring character who shows up when the plot needs someone with criminal connections and a sense of old-world dignity. The death in Donnie Fatso comes from one of the more emotionally precarious positions the show had put him in. Homer has been inadvertently recruited as an FBI informant and ends up befriending Tony genuinely, in the way Homer befriends anyone, completely, without reservation, without the social calculation that most people would bring to a friendship with a mob boss. They have a real connection. Then the FBI's plan is exposed, Tony finds out, and the confrontation that follows gives Tony a heart attack. It's not an enormous death scene. It's almost quiet, given the circumstances. A man who spent decades running criminal operations in a mid-sized American city dies of a heart attack after discovering his friend was informing on him. There's something almost mundane about it, and I think that's intentional. The show had always treated Fat Tony with a certain affectionate dignity, and his death maintains that. It doesn't make him look foolish or pathetic. He just ran out of time. And then immediately, his cousin shows up to take over the operation. The cousin's name is Fit Tony. Fit Tony is younger, leaner, and has absolutely no mob experience. He's overwhelmed by the stress of suddenly running an organized crime family. He starts eating to cope with the anxiety. By the end of the episode, Fit Tony has stress-eaten his way to roughly the same physical profile as Fat Tony, and the other mob members have started calling him Fat Tony. So life goes on in Springfield, essentially undisturbed. It's an elegant piece of writing, actually, because it acknowledges the death fully and then demonstrates that the institution, the mob, the character's role in the show's ecosystem, is bigger than any one person who holds it. Fat Tony is dead. Long live Fat Tony. Joe Mantegna continued voicing the character because the replacement had, in every meaningful sense, become the same character. The name, the voice, the role in Springfield society, all of it absorbed into the new body and carrying on. Mantegna, who was asked about the death and resurrection of the character in interviews, seemed to find it all pretty funny. He'd been playing Fat Tony for nearly 20 years by that point. The idea that a different man had become Fat Tony without any genuine change in day-to-day operations was, he suggested, entirely consistent with how mob succession usually works, both in fiction and possibly also in reality. The Fit Tony to Fat Tony transformation is worth appreciating as a piece of comedy construction because it's doing something structurally clever. The show needs to kill Fat Tony to honor the narrative logic of what's happened in the episode. He's been betrayed by a friend, he dies of the emotional shock of it, and that's the consequence. But the show also needs to continue having a Fat Tony because Fat Tony is a useful recurring character and the writers weren't ready to give up that slot in Springfield's social ecosystem. The solution Introducing an identical function character who physically transforms into the same character through the mechanics of stress eating is so elegant and so absurd simultaneously that it's almost impressive. It also works as a comment on institutional continuity. The mob doesn't lose functionality when it loses a boss. It recalibrates and continues. The institution is bigger than any individual at its head. Fit Tony didn't choose to become Fat Tony. The job made him who he had to become. There's something almost existential in that, a man consumed and reshaped by the role he accepted, until the role and the man are indistinguishable. The show doesn't press on this too hard because it's a Simpsons episode rather than a philosophy seminar, but it's there. Joe Mantegna has spoken warmly about the character in numerous interviews across the decades. He's an actor with a long association with crime drama. He's probably most widely known to audiences outside The Simpsons for his work in Criminal Minds. And he said that Fat Tony gave him a chance to play a mob figure with a specific kind of warmth and dignity that he found genuinely enjoyable. The character was never a villain in the traditional sense. He was a criminal who happened to live in Springfield. And Springfield has a way of normalizing the unusual. Fat Tony at Moe's bar ordering a beer seemed perfectly reasonable in the context of this town. The Springfield mob as a recurring element of the show is worth a moment's consideration because it's one of the more interesting background fixtures of the series. Springfield is a mid-sized American city with a full-service organized crime operation, a mayor who is transparently corrupt, a police chief of extremely limited competence, and a nuclear power plant run by a man of genuinely terrifying character. The city shouldn't function, and yet it does more or less after a fashion. Fat Tony and his operation are part of why, not in any explicit story logic sense, but in the sense that Springfield's darkness is part of its texture, and the mob is part of that darkness. And without the darkness, the town would be too simple to feel real. Fat Tony's relationship with Homer across their various interactions is one of the quietly lovely things about the character. Homer treats Fat Tony the way Homer treats everyone, with complete openness and no particular social filtering. And Fat Tony finds this both baffling and eventually somewhat endearing. There's a version of their friendship in Donnie Fatso that the episode earns genuinely. Not just a setup for the betrayal, but as a real thing that existed between two people who had no business getting along. When Tony dies, it's partly because the friendship was real, and the betrayal hit that reality hard enough to stop his heart. Which is, in the context of an animated comedy about a nuclear family in a fictional American city, a surprisingly human cause of death. Since we're on the subject of characters who sort of died and sort of didn't, here's one who was definitively killed off in one season and then kept appearing in the background for another 14 years before receiving a proper, dignified farewell. First Death, Season 23, Episode 4. Replaceable You, October 2nd, 2011. Second Death, Season 37, Episode 7. Sashes to Sashes, November 2025. Alice Glick is, in a sense, the most Springfield of all the deaths on this list. She died, she kept showing up, she died again, properly this time, and the show explicitly addressed the weirdness of it. She was Springfield's ancient neighbor character, the incredibly old woman who has been elderly for the entire run of the show, who attends church, who occasionally has brief moments of dialogue, who is mostly present as a piece of background texture. The kind of character a long-running show accumulates, someone who fills in the crowd scenes and occasionally gets a line. Tress MacNeille voiced her across her appearances. In Replaceable You, which is season 23, she's killed by a rogue robotic seal. This requires a moment of context. The episode involves Bart and Martin Prince creating a therapeutic robot seal for the elderly at the Springfield Retirement Castle, and the seal malfunctions. Alice Glick encounters the malfunctioning seal. That's that. It's a peculiar death, honestly, a bit random. The kind of thing that happens in a Simpsons episode when a character needs to die and the writers have landed on malfunctioning robot seal as the mechanism. No notes. The show doesn't dwell on it. What makes Alice Glick's situation unique is everything that followed. For after her death in season 23, the animators continued reusing her character model in background scenes. She'd show up at church, at town events, wandering in the background of crowd shots. Not as a ghost, not as an acknowledged return character, just as a recycled background figure whose model was already in the system. This went on for 14 seasons. Alice Glick died in season 23 and spent season 24 through 36 occasionally wandering into the frame like nothing had happened. The show eventually decided to address this directly, and in season 37's Sashes to Sashes, Alice is given a proper farewell episode. She dies at the church organ, quietly, doing the things she'd been doing for the entire run of the show. Its executive producer Tim Long released a statement that contained what I think is genuinely one of the funniest and most honest descriptions of a character death I've ever read. He said, "In a sense, Alice the organist will live forever through the beautiful music she made. But in another, more important sense, yep, she's dead as a doornail." That's about as perfect a summary as you can give. Honest, slightly absurd, tender in the way that comes from working with a character for a very long time, even a minor one. What Alice Glick's story says about this show at this point in its run is something I find genuinely moving. The show has been running long enough that even background characters have histories, have been present long enough to deserve acknowledgement when they go. As the animators kept accidentally including her because she was just part of the furniture of Springfield, the way certain people are just part of the furniture of our lives until they're not. And then the show noticed and made room for a proper goodbye. There's a specific quality to Alice Glick that's worth naming, which is the quality of the permanent background figure. Every long-running show, every institution, every workplace, every community has people like this. They're always there. You know their face. You know vaguely what they do. You'd notice if they were gone, but you couldn't tell you much about them beyond the fact of their consistent presence. In a real community, these people sometimes die and leave a specific kind of gap, but smaller than the gap left by someone you knew closely but strangely noticeable for the same reason. You'd stopped registering their presence as something that could be removed. The church organist role is worth a moment's thought because in a town like Springfield, the church organist is actually a quietly significant figure. The First Church of Springfield appears in dozens and dozens of episodes. It's one of the show's most reliable recurring locations, the place where Ned's faith is expressed, where community events are held, where Springfield gathers when something significant has happened. And through all of those appearances, there was always an organist, always. Alice Glick's music underscored the show's relationship with religion and community in a way that required no dialogue and no spotlight. She was just present, playing, and part of the furniture of that space. Her departure in Sashes to Sashes is fitting, precisely because it happens at the organ, in the church, during what she was doing when you'd always seen her. She doesn't die in a hospital or in some dramatic external event. She dies in her place, doing her thing, which is the most Alice Glick possible exit imaginable. Tim Long's statement, "dead as a doornail," is so perfectly calibrated in its combination of genuine affection and complete lack of sentimentality that it encapsulates something real about how long-running shows eventually have to treat their background figures. You love them in the diffuse, accumulated way you love anything familiar. And when they go, you say goodbye with warmth and a complete absence of pretension. The robotic seal that killed her in season 23 remains one of the most unusual causes of death the show has ever deployed. It's the kind of detail that sounds invented when you describe it. She was killed by a malfunctioning therapy robot designed to provide comfort to elderly residents, but is entirely in keeping with the tone of The Simpsons in that era. The The show around season 22 and 23 was in a phase of particularly heightened absurdism in its plotting. And Alice Glick's death by malfunctioning mechanical seal is a product of that. The fact that she was then allowed to haunt the background of subsequent episodes for a decade and a half before her proper farewell gives her story a strange, accidental poetry. She died, but she kept showing up, which is, in a way, exactly what the real versions of Alice Glick do in the communities that lose them. They keep appearing in memories and habits and the faint shape of the chairs they used to sit in. Not every death gets a ceremony, but sometimes a ceremony arrives late and still means something. First acknowledged, Season 25, Episode 3. 4. Regrettings and a Funeral. November 3rd, 2013. This is the one. If you've been listening to this list in order, you'll have noticed that most of these deaths have some element of craft or strategy or even comedy to them. The death is used to move the story somewhere, or to make an argument, or to resolve a narrative problem. Edna Krabappel's exit from The Simpsons doesn't have any of that. It's simply the show doing the only decent thing it could when someone genuinely beloved died in the real world. And that makes it the most quietly affecting death in the show's entire history. Marcia Wallace died on October 25th, 2013. She had been living with breast cancer for 28 years. Not a typo, 28 years. First diagnosed in 1985. She was 70 years old. She had voiced Edna Krabappel in The Simpsons since Season 1, Episode 2, Bart the Genius, which aired on January 14th, 1990. That is 24 years of the same character, the same voice, the same weary, sardonic, ultimately warm-hearted woman sitting at the front of Bart Simpson's class. Edna Krabappel is one of the great supporting characters in the show's history, and I think she often gets slightly undersold in those conversations because she was a supporting character rather than a lead. But think about what she was for 2.5 decades. She was Bart's teacher, or the person who bore the full brunt of his chaos every single day without being able to escape it, and she kept showing up anyway. She was perpetually tired, perpetually a little disappointed in the world, perpetually fond of a cigarette and a drink at the end of a long week. She was a divorced woman in a town full of intact families, living alone, doing her job with competence and very little recognition. And then, in Season 22, Ned Flanders, still recovering from Maud's death 11 seasons earlier, still finding his way as a widower and single father. And Edna found each other. They were, on paper, the least likely couple in Springfield. Ned with his relentless optimism and biblical punctuality and terrible sweaters, Edna with her cigarette and her long history of disappointment with the men she'd chosen. But the show made it work. It made it feel earned. They got married. They made each other happy. And for Edna, after decades of being the lonely teacher in the small house, that meant something. When Marcia Wallace died, the production had to decide what to do. They did not recast the character. This is worth noting. Krabappel was a significant enough character that recasting her would have been noticed, would have felt wrong, and the show chose not to do it. They also chose not to simply retire her quietly without acknowledgement. Season 25, Episode 3. 4 Regrettings and a Funeral is the first episode after the news of Wallace's death broke publicly. It opens in the main storyline with a different death in Springfield, but woven through it is a single image that has stayed in the memory of everyone who watched it. Bart Simpson at the chalkboard, in writing, "We'll really miss you, Mrs. K." Not a gag, not a punchline at the end, just Bart writing the thing that needed to be said in the only format the show had ever given him to say it. The chalkboard gag had been a fixture of The Simpsons since the very beginning. It opens every episode. Bart writes some self-referential joke or absurdist statement as his punishment. It's one of the most recognizable images in television history. to repurpose it as a memorial, to take the place where the show had always put its silliest jokes and use it instead to say goodbye to someone who mattered, was a piece of elegant simplicity that required no explanation and no embellishment. The relationship between Bart and Edna deserves some attention here because it's one of the most quietly complex relationships in the show's run. On the surface, it's adversarial. Bart is the chaos. Edna is the authority trying to contain it. He undermines her. She disciplines him. He invents increasingly creative ways to make her day difficult. She responds with increasingly creative ways to document his misconduct. The surface level of their dynamic is pure comedy. The student from hell and the teacher at the end of her rope. But underneath that, the show periodically lets something else show. Edna knows Bart, really knows him, in the way teachers sometimes know difficult students better than easier ones, because the difficult ones require so much more attention, so much more of your energy and patience, that you end up with a detailed understanding of who they are that the well-behaved kids never provoke. Edna knows that Bart is smarter than he lets on. She knows he's acting out rather than genuinely not caring. She's frustrated by this constantly because she can see what he could do if he tried, and he mostly doesn't try. But she also never stops trying with him, which is a form of respect that gets overlooked in the comedy of their relationship. The chalkboard memorial isn't Bart acknowledging Edna from outside the relationship as a distant tribute. It's Bart, who was closer to Edna than almost anyone except possibly Ned, doing the thing she made him do all those years and meaning it for the first time. He wrote on that chalkboard because she made him write on that chalkboard thousands of times as punishment and consequence and the particular kind of education that only happens when someone refuses to give up on you. She shaped the gesture that he used to say goodbye to her. Now that's a beautiful thing. Later in season 25, in episode 12, The Man Who Grew Too Much, there's a scene in which Ned is seen quietly grieving. The show doesn't make a big moment of it. Just Ned, alone, holding something that was Edna's. It's brief. It doesn't need to be long. The show never gave Edna a death episode. We were never shown what happened to her, how she died, what the moment was. She was simply gone, the way people are simply gone. And the characters who had known her were left to carry that in the ways people carry these things. I think that was the right choice. To have staged Edna's death, to have built a storyline around it, would have been a performance. What the show did instead, marking her absence quietly, letting Bart say what needed to be said on the chalkboard. Letting Ned have his moment of private grief felt like the real thing. Marcia Wallace had, by all accounts, loved Edna. She found the character funny and sad in the specific combination she appreciated, and she was proud of what the character had come to represent over 24 years. She'd won an Emmy for her work as Krabappel in 1992. She gave interview after interview, talking about how much the role meant to her, how strange and wonderful it was to be part of something that had lasted that long, that had been seen by so many people in so many countries. There is a version of Edna Krabappel that exists in the earlier seasons of the show that I find almost unbearably real. She's in her 40s, sitting at her desk in a primary school classroom, enduring the kind of professional day that would break most people. And she has a certain look on her face that she gives Bart. Exasperated, yes, but also something warmer underneath. She sees him. Even when she's frustrated with him, she sees him. That quality in the character, the quality of someone who shows up and does the work even when the work is exhausting, is a reflection of the woman who gave her voice for 2.5 decades. One thing I keep thinking about when I think about Edna is the way she was used in the show's earlier seasons versus the way she evolved in the later ones. In seasons 1 through, say, 8 or 9, she was primarily a comedy character. The tired teacher, the woman smoking in the car park, the person whose romantic life was a string of disappointments. The show found her funny, and she was funny. But there was always something underneath that the show occasionally let out, a real person in there with real feelings about her life and her choices that would surface in quieter moments before the episode moved on. The marriage to Ned in season 22, specifically in The Bob Next Door, and then formally in season 23's A Totally Fun Thing That Bart Will Never Do Again, changed what the show could do with her. Suddenly Edna wasn't lonely anymore. Suddenly there was someone who looked at her with genuine warmth, whose optimism was so relentless that it was actually disarming, and who made her laugh in spite of herself. The dynamic between Ned and Edna worked because they were genuinely incompatible on the surface and genuinely right for each other underneath. And the show had spent enough time with both of them individually that you believed it. Marsha Wallace's Emmy win in 1992 for outstanding voice acting was one of the first times the Television Academy formally acknowledged the voice cast of The Simpsons, and it was deserved in a way that the award given in 1992 probably didn't fully capture. At that point, the show was only in its third season. The full measure of what Wallace was building across the run of the series wasn't visible yet. 20 years of additional Edna had to happen before the complete picture was clear. The decision not to recast Edna, I should say, was also an implicit statement about what the character meant within the show's internal culture. Several major recurring characters have been recast over the years when voice actors became unavailable or stepped back. The core six have never been recast, but supporting characters have changed voices occasionally. Edna was not recast. She was retired. That's a form of respect that the production didn't have to extend and chose to. Springfield is smaller without her. A lot of the things that make that town feel real are gone now or changed, and Edna is one of the largest of those absences. The empty desk at the front of Bart's class, the bar stool at Moe's where she used to sit with a drink at the end of the week, the fact that Ned doesn't have anyone to come home to anymore. And that last detail is worth sitting with for a moment because Ned Flanders has now lost 2 wives. Maud went in season 11. Edna went in season 25 when Marsha Wallace died. 12 years apart, 2 women who defined 2 different phases of his life, both gone. And the show hasn't made a whole production of this. Ned doesn't get extended grief episodes after Edna the way he did after Maud. But the weight of it is there if you're watching. He is a man who has been left twice by people he loved, through no fault of his own, and who has kept going with that relentless, battered optimism of his because that's what Ned does. He keeps going. There's something genuinely admirable in that, even as a fictional quality. Ned Flanders was designed as a caricature. The neighbor who's too good, too cheerful, too religious, too everything. And across 35 seasons, the show has quietly turned him into one of its most fully realized figures. The caricature was always underlaid by something real, and the losses have been part of what revealed it. A man who's lost that much and kept his faith and his warmth and his general willingness to show up for the people around him is, whether the show intended this or not, a portrait of a certain kind of resilience that doesn't get credited because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Some of these losses are written, some of them just happen. Edna's is both at once, and that's what makes her different from everyone else on this list. Season 26, Episode 1, Clown in the Dumps, September 28, 2014. The promotion for Clown in the Dumps was one of the more interesting pieces of PR the show has done in its later years. Fox announced in advance that the episode's premiere would feature the death of a beloved Simpsons character and declined to say who. The speculation was considerable. People went through the full cast and started ranking their guesses. Homer? No, surely not. Bart? Marge? One of the extended family? The internet worked itself into a reasonable frenzy, and then the episode aired, and the beloved character who died was Rabbi Hyman Krustovsky. Krusty the Clown's father, voiced by Jackie Mason across a small number of appearances going back to season 3. The reception was mixed. Some people felt genuinely moved. A meaningful number of other people felt slightly let down, having steeled themselves for something more central to the show's fabric. and received instead the death of a relatively minor recurring character. There was a fair amount of, "Oh, is that all?" in the online response, which is a slightly uncomfortable thing to say about any fictional character's death, but there we are. I think the mixed reaction somewhat undersells what the rabbi meant to the show's history. His introduction in Season 3, Episode 6, Like Father, Like Clown, which aired October 24th, 1991, is one of the great early guest episodes. The premise is a direct parody of The Jazz Singer, Krusty's estrangement from his father, a distinguished rabbi, because the rabbi had disowned him for going into comedy rather than following him into the rabbinate. Bart and Lisa reunite them through a series of increasingly elaborate Talmudic arguments. It's genuinely funny and surprisingly touching for an episode built on a very Jewish-American family dynamic. Jackie Mason voiced the rabbi with real warmth. Mason was himself a former rabbi, which gave the performance an authenticity that went beyond the script. The voice and the character felt lived in. Do you believe that this man had been disappointed in his son for 30 years, and that this disappointment was coming from love rather than cruelty? The death in Clown in the Dumps follows Krusty into grief after his father passes suddenly. The episode is primarily about Krusty's crisis of confidence. His father died before definitively telling him whether he thought his son was funny. This is the specific wound Krusty is left with. Not that his father is gone exactly, but that the verdict he had been waiting for his whole career never came. The resolution is lovely. Krusty learns that one of his father's favorite rabbis had been quoting Krusty's own jokes in his sermons, not attributing them, just using them, and that this rabbi had found them genuinely wise and funny. The rabbi laughed at his son's comedy, and he just never said it directly. And so Krusty is left with a version of peace, not the explicit approval he'd been seeking, but evidence of it, arrived secondhand and posthumously, which is how a lot of important messages between parents and children tend to arrive. Jackie Mason himself passed away on July 24th, 2021. He was 93. He'd had a long and complicated career in comedy, stand-up, television, Broadway, legal disputes, public feuds, the full spectrum. And his work as Rabbi Kristofsky was a relatively small part of that legacy, but it was a warmly regarded one. The character had appeared across the show's history as a reminder that even the most outwardly ridiculous characters in Springfield, and Krusty the Clown is, by design, extremely outwardly ridiculous, have something serious and sincere underneath. There's a broader thing the rabbi's death episode is doing that I appreciate, which is that it refuses to make the grief simple. Krusty doesn't just mourn his father, he mourns the unsaid thing. He mourns the approval that existed but was never spoken. And the episode gently suggests that this is very common, that most of us are waiting for someone to tell us something important that they're holding back, and that sometimes they take it with them before they get around to saying it. We touched on a version of this with Mona Simpson earlier in the list, but where Homer's situation was about an unfinished conversation driven by mutual hurt, Krusty's is about a father who loved and respected his son, and simply, inexplicably, as parents sometimes inexplicably do, forgot to say so in plain terms. It's a smaller and quieter sadness, but it's a real one. The context around the promotion of this episode is worth examining a little more because it tells you something about how The Simpsons managed its public image in season 26. Which was, by that point, already well into what most people would describe as the show's extended later period. The announcement that a beloved character would die was a deliberate PR move, designed to generate the kind of pre-broadcast attention the show used to attract organically in its peak years. And it worked. The speculation was genuine, people were invested. The mixed reaction when the answer was revealed that the beloved character was the rabbi rather than Homer or Marge or Bart says something slightly uncomfortable about how casual our relationship with minor recurring characters actually is when tested. Everyone said they loved Rabbi Kristofsky. But when his death was the one that arrived, a significant portion of the audience felt cheated. The gap between beloved as a general category and beloved enough to justify this much anticipation turned out to be meaningful. I don't think that makes the episode wrong or the choice wrong. I think the rabbi was a genuinely good choice for exactly the reasons I've already described. The emotional weight of what he and Krusty represented, and the specific sadness of the unsaid thing. The episode is more interesting than if Homer had died, but the promotion had raised expectations in a direction that the episode couldn't fully satisfy, which is a lesson in managing audience anticipation that the show probably drew its own conclusions from. It's also worth placing like Father and like Clown, the rabbi's introduction episode in season 3, in its broader context because it's doing something fairly unusual for American primetime animation in 1991. The episode is deeply, unironically engaged with Jewish tradition. The arguments Bart and Lisa use to reunite Krusty and his father are drawn from genuine Talmudic reasoning. The episode doesn't play Jewish religious practice as exotic or strange. It treats it as a real tradition with real internal logic, and uses that logic as the mechanism of the plot. For a show on Fox in 1991 that was primarily known for anarchic comedy, this is a notably sincere piece of television. Jackie Mason himself was a genuinely complex figure in American comedy, and he had come up through the Borscht Belt tradition, the Jewish resort circuit in the Catskills that had produced many of the great mid-century American comedians. And his act was always specifically, unmistakably rooted in Jewish American experience. His voice, his timing, his entire comedic sensibility were expressions of that background. When the show cast him as the rabbi, it wasn't just casting a famous comedian. It was casting someone whose entire identity as a performer was continuous with the character he was playing. The rabbi's voice had lived in Jackie Mason before it ever lived in the character. The show's treatment of religion generally is something that doesn't get discussed quite enough in the context of its longevity. The Simpsons has been engaging with faith and religious practice since season 1. And while Ned Flanders is the most prominent expression of that engagement, the rabbi represents something slightly different. A tradition with its own specific history, its own internal debates, its own particular relationship to humor and grief. The show treated that tradition seriously, which is part of why the rabbi's appearances across the series carry the weight they do. Jackie Mason himself passed away on July 24th, 2021. He was 93. He'd had a long and complicated career in comedy, stand-up, television, Broadway, legal disputes, public feuds, the full spectrum, and his work as Rabbi Krustovsky was a relatively small part of that legacy. But it was a warmly regarded one. The character had appeared across the show's history as a reminder that even the most outwardly ridiculous characters in Springfield, and Krusty the Clown is, by design, extremely outwardly ridiculous, have something serious and sincere underneath. Season 35, Episode 15. Cremains of the Day. March 10th, 2024. Larry Dalrymple, Larry the Barfly, as he's known in most Simpsons fan contexts, had been sitting on a stool at Moe's Tavern since season 1. He appears in the premiere, in the background, barely acknowledged as part of the ambient humanity of the bar. He's there when Homer is there. He's there when Homer's not there. He's just always at Moe's, nursing a drink, occasionally having a line that goes nowhere in particular. Over 35 seasons, Larry never had an episode to himself. He never had a major storyline. He was Springfield's most committed background character, more consistent than almost anyone else in the entire series, and more reliably present at Moe's than even some of the show's named regulars, but always on the periphery, always in the background, a face you knew without necessarily knowing his name. Cremains of the Day is built entirely around what happens when that kind of person dies. Larry collapses at the bar, and then Homer, Moe, Lenny, and Carl have to plan a funeral, and discover that none of them can answer basic questions about who Larry actually was. Where did he live? Did he have a family? What did he do outside the bar? Did he have interests, opinions, a history? They'd seen him nearly every day for years, and they had almost nothing to go on. The episode follows them trying to piece together a picture of a man from fragments, old records, rumors, at the minimal trail someone leaves when they spend their life on the fringes of other people's lives. What they find is genuinely touching and a little sad. A person who showed up, who was present, who chose to spend his time in a certain place with certain people, but who never quite broke through into the inner circle. Not because he was rejected, nobody ever pushed Larry away, but because he was always slightly outside the glass, looking in. The title is a pun. Cremains. The remains after cremation, riffing on Remains of the Day, the Kazuo Ishiguro novel about a formal English butler who realizes too late that he spent his entire life in professional detachment rather than actual human connection. I don't know if the writers intended that comparison to be taken seriously, or if it's just a pun for the sake of a pun. Oh, but it fits so perfectly that it works either way. Larry is a different kind of Stevens, not a man who repressed his feelings out of professional duty, but a man who just never quite pushed into the center of things. The episode received warm reviews, which says something. A lot of people who write about The Simpsons have long since adopted a weary tone toward the later seasons. The sense that the golden age is behind us and what remains is extended corporate maintenance of a historic property. And here was an episode about a character who had never mattered, officially, receiving a death that actually landed. Critics found it genuinely moving. Part of why it works is that Larry's death isn't really about Larry. It's about the people he left behind trying to understand the gap he made. Moe, in particular, who was unsettled by how little he knows about a man he'd served drinks to for 35 years. There's something in that which most of us recognize. The peripheral people in our lives, the ones we see regularly without quite knowing, and the strange, specific grief when they're gone. Moe's Tavern has always been one of the more quietly observed spaces in Springfield. It's where Homer goes to escape, but it's also a genuinely social institution, a place where people gather because they need to be around other people, even if they're not going to talk about anything important. The relationship between the regulars at Moe's isn't warm exactly, but it's real. They show up, they sit together, they endure each other. And after 35 years of that, it turns out none of them knows where Larry lived. Then that gap between the frequency of contact and the depth of knowledge is something Moe's Tavern has always quietly embodied. And Cremains of the Day is the episode that finally names it directly. There's a kind of friendship that happens in places like this, at a bar or a local cafe or any recurring gathering point, where the familiarity is genuine but the intimacy is limited. You know the person's face, you know their order, you know roughly how they've been this week from the look they come in wearing. But you don't know much about their life outside this room, and most of the time that feels fine, a comfortable arrangement that asks nothing demanding of either party. It only feels incomplete when they're gone and you realize you can't answer the basic questions at the funeral. The Larry's death episode doesn't judge anyone for this. It doesn't suggest that Homer or Moe or Lenny or Carl failed Larry by not knowing him better. It observes without particular condemnation that this is simply how certain kinds of presence work. You can share a space with someone for decades and still, at the end, know very little about who they were when they walked out the door. And the show asks the audience to sit with that, gently, without resolution. There's also something in Cremains of the Day that functions as a kind of self-portrait of the show itself. The Simpsons has been on the air since 1989. It has accumulated more background characters than any other animated series in history. People who showed up once or twice and have since been reused as crowd filler across hundreds of episodes. They're present but never given anything to do, part of the fabric of Springfield without ever becoming part of the story. Larry is the most prominent of these, but he's not the only one. There are dozens of faces in the background of Moe's Tavern that have been there for 35 years and never had a storyline. An episode that asks what we actually know about these people is an episode the show could only have made after it had been running long enough to accumulate them. The title pun is exact. Cremains of the Day. The remains after cremation, riffing on Ishiguro's novel about a life spent in service without genuine connection. Whether that's an intentional literary reference or a coincidence of language, the parallel is precise enough to be worth sitting with. Larry served the same function in Springfield that Steven serves in the novel. A constant, reliable, dependable presence at the edges of other people's important moments, whose own interior life remained essentially unknown until it was too late to ask about it. There's something in that which connects Larry's story to the broader observation about why this list exists at all. Springfield is full of people we've been watching for decades without knowing. Some of them die, most of them don't. The ones who die leave a gap that looks small from the outside, a bar stool, a background face missing from the crowd, and turns out to be something larger when you actually think about what was there. Since we're talking about people who have left Springfield over the years, there are a few more I want to mention before we get to the end. Characters who went quietly, or whose departures happened off screen, or who exist in that slightly unusual category of being dead but never having been shown dying. Not everyone on this list gets a death scene. Some characters in Springfield simply aren't there anymore. And we find out why through a line in a later episode, a small throwaway acknowledgement, a memorial that appears in the background of a scene we weren't necessarily paying close attention to. These are the quiet departures, the ones that require you to have been paying attention for a long time to catch. Snowball 1 is probably the earliest of these. The original Simpson family cat died before the series even began. Mentioned in Marge's Christmas letter in the premiere episode are in that detail about a Chrysler being involved. We never met Snowball the first. She existed entirely in the past tense. But she's the reason there's a Snowball the second, which makes her the beginning of a chain of cats that runs all the way through 15 seasons of the show. The unnamed losses are sometimes the ones that cause the longest ripples. Clancy Bouvier, Marge's father, is an interesting case because his death is confirmed in 2 separate episodes, years apart, almost as if the show itself wasn't certain when it happened. In Jazzy and the Pussycats, season 18, Homer mentions that Clancy Bouvier died. In Puffless, season 27, the cause is specified lung cancer from the cigarettes he spent his life smoking, sharing the habit with his daughters Patty and Selma, who have been lighting up on screen since season 1. It's a death you see coming from decades away, embedded in a character detail that the show introduced in its earliest episodes. The man smoked himself to death, and eventually the show confirmed it, and that's all we ever got. What I find poignant about Clancy's death is its relationship to Patty and Selma's ongoing smoking habit. The show acknowledged that their father died of lung cancer, and Patty and Selma have continued smoking across every subsequent season without visible worry, which is both a reflection of Springfield's non-linear relationship with consequence and also, if you're being uncharitable, a representation of something very human. Knowing exactly what the thing costs and doing it anyway, because stopping feels harder than continuing. There's also the matter of Dr. Nick Riviera. Hi, everybody. If you've watched The Simpsons at all, you know that line. Dr. Nick was the cut-price physician who turned up whenever Homer needed medical advice of questionable reliability, voiced by Hank Azaria with marvelous incompetence. In the Simpsons movie from 2007, Dr. Nick is shown being killed, definitively, very clearly, during the film's chaos. And yet, Dr. Nick has continued to appear in the television series after the film, without any acknowledgement of his cinematic demise. The show's relationship with the movie's continuity is not airtight, to put it mildly. Dr. Nick persists. I'm not going to explain this. I'm not sure the writers could explain this. There are also, I should mention, some characters whose deaths happened entirely off-screen between seasons and were confirmed only in passing. Sideshow Bob's wife was briefly dead in one episode and then referenced as alive in a later one. The show has always maintained the kind of loose relationship with its own history that allows for occasional contradictions to be waved through without explanation. And then there's the whole category of Treehouse of Horror deaths, which I've deliberately excluded from this list, but which deserve acknowledgement. Every October, everyone in Springfield dies. Homer dies. Marge dies. Bart, Lisa, Maggie, the Flanders children, the full set, sometimes multiple times in the same episode. The show has been processing mortality through horror comedy every Halloween since 1990. And in that context, death has never been a threat. It's a genre exercise. It's the show playing with darkness in a contained space where nothing matters. The fact that the show can do both things, treat death as completely consequence-free and hilarious in the Treehouse specials, and then turn around and handle the real exits with genuine care, says something about the range of what The Simpsons is capable of, even after this long. And while we're here, there's also the strange case of Disco Stu. Disco Stu, real name Stuart Discotheque, or just Stu, voiced by Hank Azaria, is very much still alive and occasionally showing up in Springfield. He's not on this list, but he's the kind of character who functions as a reminder of how many recurring figures the show has accumulated across its run, who exist at the exact boundary between recurring character and background element. Disco Stu has appeared in dozens of episodes. He has a personality, a visual signature, a recurring joke built around him, and yet he has never had anything close to a main storyline. And when Hank Azaria stepped back from non-black characters in 2020, Stu was among those who lost their voice. He persists in background scenes, unvoiced the way Apu persists, present but hollowed out in some sense. The show has never been fully honest about what to do with the characters whose voice actors changed or stepped back without the character dying in story. These are a different kind of absence. Not deaths exactly, but a severing of something. The voice that made the character specific is gone, and what remains is a name and a visual and a hollow where the performance used to live. There's also the matter of a handful of characters who died off-screen in ways that were acknowledged so briefly they barely registered. Sideshow Bob's father was mentioned as having died in a line that most viewers didn't catch. Various Springfield residents have been confirmed dead through references in episodes where they weren't the focus. The show's background universe has more deaths in it than you'd probably guess, most of them unremarked and unremarkable. Springfield's natural attrition rate playing out in the background of stories about other things. There's one more character I want to talk about here, separate from the others, because his story is a little different from everyone else on this list. He didn't die in an episode, he wasn't killed off by a storyline decision or a contract dispute. He was retired quietly, impermanently, with a kind of willful ambiguity that has never quite been resolved. But his absence from Springfield is real, and the reason for it is tied to one of the most complicated stories in the show's recent history. That's Apu. I'm not going to dwell on this one at length because it's more about the show's cultural politics than about character death, and that's a different kind of conversation. But briefly, Apu Nahasapima Petilon, the owner of the Quick E-Mart, was voiced by Hank Azaria from season 1 until 2020, when Azaria stepped back from the role following a sustained public conversation about the ethics of a white American actor, voicing a South Asian character through broad stereotype performance. Azaria himself initiated the decision and has spoken publicly about his regret over elements of the performance. Apu didn't die. He just stopped having lines. He still exists, sort of in the background of Springfield, like a ghost who shows up occasionally without speaking. Whether that's better or worse than being killed off cleanly is genuinely hard to say. It's an uncomfortable resolution to an uncomfortable situation, and I mention it here because this list would feel incomplete without at least acknowledging the space where a character used to be. What all of these overlooked or partial departures share is the quality of being real losses without the ceremony that usually marks real losses. The show keeps going. Springfield keeps being Springfield. The missing faces recede into the background until the background has quietly changed shape, and you notice it only if you've been paying close attention for a very long time. There's a broader observation to be made here about how The Simpsons handles the deaths of characters who exist primarily as backstory. Clancy Bouvier is the clearest example, a character who only ever existed in the past tense as a reference, as context for Marge and her sisters, and whose death is confirmed offhandedly in a line that most people watching the episode in question weren't paying particular attention to. He never had a storyline, he barely had a presence. And yet when Homer mentions that he died, and when a later episode fills in the cause as lung cancer, smoking, Patty and Selma's inheritance of that habit, the long, slow arithmetic of the family's relationship with cigarettes finally producing its inevitable result, it lands as something real. This is a thing The Simpsons does in its best moments. It makes the off-screen world feel populated. Characters have histories that extend beyond what we've been shown. People die who we never met. Fathers pass away, old friends from decades before the show's present drift out of existence. The show isn't required to show you all of this, but it nods at it consistently enough that Springfield feels like a place where life is happening in all the rooms you're not looking into. The counterexample, Dr. Nick persisting cheerfully after his cinematic death, is also instructive. The show's relationship with its own movie is one of selective acknowledgement. Storylines and character developments from the film are referenced occasionally but not consistently maintained. This is probably a creative decision rather than an oversight. The movie was a contained event, a different kind of Simpsons, and integrating its deaths and consequences fully into the ongoing series would have required a level of continuity management the show has generally avoided. Dr. Nick's survival is less a continuity error than a statement of intent. The movie happened in a particular register, and the series gets to decide which of its events carry over. That selective approach to consequence runs through the whole list we've discussed tonight. The show chooses which deaths matter, it chooses which absences to honor and which to quietly not follow up on. And in making those choices, it reveals its own priorities. Which characters it thought deserved the weight of permanence and which it treated more casually. What the full scope of these quiet departures tells you, taken together, is that Springfield has been accumulating losses for a very long time in all their different registers. The formal, the mourned, the offhand, the unresolved. The deaths that got episodes, the deaths that got a line, the absences that were never explained and never needed to be. Somewhere in that accumulation is a portrait of what it actually feels like to live somewhere for a long time. Not the dramatic exits, not the clean narrative resolutions, but the slow, steady accumulation of people who used to be there and aren't anymore, and the gradual reshaping of what familiar looks like without them. Springfield keeps going. That's the deal. The town persists. The title sequence runs, the donut resets. But underneath the loop, what's in the gaps and the empty seats and the voices that aren't there when they used to be, the history is real. And it adds up. There is a pattern running through everything we've talked about tonight, and I want to name it before we finish. It's not about death exactly, it's about what the people who were here meant to the place they were in, and what the place is like once they've gone. Bleeding gums. Murphy meant that Lisa had been seen, really seen specifically as herself, the particular, sad, joyful, hungry person she is. Before she was old enough to articulate what that was. His death in season 6 didn't just take away a character, it took away the first adult outside her family who had looked at her and understood what was there. Springfield is missing that now. Lisa carries it forward. But she carries it differently than she would if he'd stayed. Frank Grimes meant that the show could look at itself honestly. His presence in that one episode was a mirror that the show held up to its own universe and didn't flinch from. He saw how unfair the world was and was destroyed by it, and the comedy of his destruction doesn't cancel out what the destruction says. Springfield is missing its critic now. Nobody else has ever tried to apply logic to it in quite that way. Maud's death meant that Ned had something real to lose, and discovering what that loss did to him took more than a decade of television to properly show. Ned before Maud is defined by stability and faith. Ned after is something more complicated and more real. A man who had to find out what he was made of when the things he'd built his life around were taken away. The Ned who eventually marries Edna Krabappel is possible only because Maud died. Mona meant that Homer's past was real. She made his history specific, gave it weight and consequence that the show's floating timeline would otherwise have dissolved. When she died, Springfield lost the person who explained why Homer was the way he was. What Edna gave Springfield was attention, the specific, sustained attention that good teachers bring to difficult children. She spent 24 years watching Bart. She saw every version of him. She kept showing up. A desk at the front of a classroom that nobody has quite figured out how to fill properly since. Not because the teacher isn't good, but because 24 years of that particular attention can't be replicated. Rabbi Kristofsky meant that Krusty had a history and therefore a wound, and therefore a depth that went past the comedy. Without the rabbi, Krusty becomes simpler, more a joke, less a person. And Larry meant that someone was always there, not doing anything important, just present, reliably at the same stool for 35 years. His death exposes the gap that his presence had been filling. The sense that the bar is complete when all its regulars are in their places. That particular kind of absence is one of the most honest things the show has ever done. We've come to the end of the list, which means we've come to the end of the people who are in Springfield and are no longer in Springfield in the way they used to be. And sitting with all of them together, bleeding gums in the park at 2 a.m, Frank Grimes falling backwards with 2 live wires in his hands, a Maud tumbling from the bleachers at a NASCAR race, Mona dying on a couch in her son's living room while he was still angry at her, Edna never coming back to the front of Bart's classroom. They form a strange and specific kind of list, not the biggest deaths in television history, not the most shocking, but a collection of exits that says something about what it means to live in a place for a very long time. Springfield hasn't changed. That's the premise, the foundation, the whole deal. Bart is still 10. Homer still has the same job. The town looks more or less the way it looked in 1989, give or take some updated technology and the occasional redesign. But the people in it are not entirely the same people they were. Some chairs are empty now, some relationships have a shape to them that they didn't used to have. Ned, particularly, or exists in a different register than he did before Maud, and the show has honored that. Krusty carries the weight of his father's unspoken approval. Homer has, somewhere underneath all the chaos, the memory of sitting on the roof of his car watching the stars and missing his mother. The show doesn't usually make a big deal of this. That's also part of the deal. The Simpsons has always processed grief sideways, through comedy, through absurdity, through the deliberate refusal to let the emotional weight of something crush the episode it's living in. But the grief is there. It doesn't go away just because the show keeps going and the title sequence keeps looping and Bart keeps riding his skateboard down the same street. What I keep coming back to, thinking about all of these exits, is the voice actors. The people who showed up and gave these characters their voices and their personalities and their specific rhythms of speech across years and decades of episodes. Ron Taylor playing Bleeding Gums and understanding him from the inside. Maggie Roswell spending years flying from Denver to Los Angeles to be Maud, and then not flying anymore, and Maud ceasing to exist. Marsha Wallace with 24 years of Edna behind her and then 24 years of absence after. Jackie Mason as a former rabbi playing a rabbi and bringing something to it that couldn't be faked. These are collaborations that lasted longer than most careers, that produced something that was watched by hundreds of millions of people in dozens of countries across more than 3 decades. The loss of any one of these characters is also, in some sense, the end of one of those collaborations. And in the cases where the loss happened because the person died, it's a reminder that the voices behind the show are as mortal as anyone else, that the floating timeline of Springfield doesn't extend to the people making it. There's a reason the show works at night, when you're tired, when you're not quite awake enough to need something new, but alert enough to want something familiar. Springfield is known in a way that very little television manages after this many years. The rhythms are known, the voices are known, the town is known, and even with its losses, even with the empty spaces where Edna and Maud and Bleeding Gums used to be, it still feels like a place you can visit and find your way around. The ones who are gone are part of why it feels that way, I think. The presence of loss is part of what makes a place feel real. And Springfield wouldn't feel like a town if everyone just went on forever without anything ever changing. The gaps in the fabric, the absent voice at the front of the class, the chair at the bar, nobody quite feels the same way. The cloud that looks like a saxophone player dissolving into the evening sky. Those are part of what gives it weight. Sleep well. Springfield will still be there in the morning, the same as it always has been. And so will all the people in it who are still there, still going, still enduring Homer and the plant, and the long Springfield winters and the inexplicable proximity of a tire fire to a residential street. The ones who are gone shaped what the town became. They are absolutely worth remembering, every single one of them.